Chapter 32 begins with the pranayama perspective. Pranayama has got nothing to do with self-enquiry, but there is a strand in the Yoga Vasishta which seems to be attempting to put pranayama on a par with self-enquiry. Perhaps it's true that pranayama might be helpful. It might help in bringing the attention to that point, a kind of intermediate point, whereby it can then turn upon itself and we have self-enquiry. But this can be done without pranayama. It can be done in many different ways. And the trouble is, when you start looking into pranayama, you start getting caught up in yogic notions. And yoga tends to give the impression that the body is something real. It's very much focused on the body. So you really have to invest quite a lot in the notion of the body. And you have to invest quite a lot in the notion of prana itself. Personally, I don't think in terms of prana. I possibly could get into thinking in terms of prana. I'm sure there are sensations which I could understand as prana. I could understand the breath as prana. But then I'll start getting into all the theories about prana. I'll start doing the pranic exercises. I'll start having to get into ideas of purification of the body. There are many yogic exercises for physically purifying the body, cleaning the stomach and all the rest of it. And purifying the mind, and the mind will have to be regarded as a real thing. They're inert but real, and so on. We don't need any of that. But there is this strand in the Yoga Vasishta. I think it's a strand which is very often put in its place. It's made quite clear that it is purely secondary. But there are times it seems to have undue prominence. The Lord said, "But for the mind and prana, the body is an inert mass. Just as a piece of iron moves in the presence of a magnet, even so the jiva moves in the very presence of consciousness, which is infinite and omnipresent. The body is inert and dependent. It is made to function by the consciousness which believes itself to be similar to the vital airs, prana. Thus it is the karma self, or the active self, karmatma, that keeps the body in motion. It is, however, the Supreme Self itself that has ordained both the mind and the prana as the promoters of life in the body. It is the consciousness itself, assuming inertia, which rides the mind as the jiva." So we've got a lot of theorizing here, conceptualizing. The last sentence though, it is the consciousness itself, assuming inertia, which rides the mind as the jiva. That's something which we can see for ourselves as empirically obvious. My understanding of spirituality is that it is something which is obvious. It's something which is empirical. It isn't about notions, no matter how sublime. It's something which is directly observable. So in this way, for me, spirituality is scientific. It's what is clearly obvious. It's not down to a matter of interpretation, because we're removing all interpretations. So it seems to me prana is a theory. It might be a very useful theory in many ways, but it's an interpretation. Because all there is consciousness itself. It clearly assumes notions of inertia and notions of the mind and individuality. Once this limitation is established, then other consequences follow. They are the physical and mental diseases. Once you start believing in your notions, in your stories, then limitations and sorrow follow. It's a bit like believing in Santa Claus, and then you'll get upset every Christmas when he doesn't bring presents down your chimney. This believing in your stories has consequences. This is like waves first arising on the surface of the ocean and then creating ripples and so forth. The consciousness as jiva becomes dependent, having abandoned the self-knowledge as consciousness. So consciousness starts believing in its own limitations. It's abandoned awareness of its own nature. This is always the choice we've got. We can identify with awareness, which is awareness identifying with awareness, or awareness can identify with all the notions that arise within it. Notions of me, you, a world out there, a body here. All these are notions of perception. And once we start investing in these notions, we experience limitation and sorrow. It's not to dismiss these notions. Stories have their purpose. All stories have their purpose. Stories have their uses. It's when we start believing these stories to be truth that we're in trouble. Labouring under a thick veil of ignorance, it is foolishly unable to recognise the harm that it has brought upon itself, even as a drunkard wielding a sword cuts his own leg. However, even as the drunkard can soon become sober, this consciousness can soon regain self-knowledge. So consciousness can very easily become once more conscious of itself.